strip away all that gets in the way so that our souls are laid bare for you and for you alone. Help us as we learn more today and as we prepare for Lent, that we may know your love and hear and see your love in these words that we will read and study. Help everything that we do make us realize that this is your word that calls us to serve you as suffering servants, that we may see in you and all the things that we see as obstacles and things that get in the way, that actually they draw us closer to you and closer to the sufferings of your Son, Jesus Christ, who is our Lord forever and ever. Amen. Welcome, everybody, to our last letter that we're going to be doing before Lent. So just to kind of review what our schedule is, today we're doing 2 Corinthians, and this is it for letters of Paul until after Lent. Next week, Pastor Ronnie will again do a Bible study on 2 Corinthians, and then the week after that, Pastor Dean will begin first with the book study. Now, I have the books up here. Did anybody not get a book? Did anybody? So I'll take care of that afterwards. If you paid for one and haven't picked it up yet, at the end of class, I'll take care of that.
And if you have an extra one, I'll buy it.
And that was the other thing I was going to say. We no longer have any extra ones. We sold our last extra one last night. So I will say that the book is $10 if you buy it from us, but if you get it from Amazon, it's $13. So it's not like it's a huge, huge difference. Yeah. Okay. For anyone who is getting it on your own, I'll show you what it looks like too, so that if you're looking at it on Amazon, you'll see. It's Mitch Albom's book, A-L-B-O-M, and it's called The Next Person You Meet in Heaven, which is a sequel to The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. Okay?
Is this a one-time class?
It is a one-time class. So that will be Ash Wednesday. Actually, he does that. And the time during Lent changes back to 9 o'clock so that you'll be able to finish class in time to be able to go to Ash Wednesday and the midweek Lenten services. So anybody who paid for a book, I'll take care of that at the end. Secondly, if you didn't pick up one of these Lenten devotionals, okay, this is... and Hope University gets this every year. It is a devotional just for Lent. And since Hope University pays for it, we have it up here first to offer it to those who come to Hope University. So it will be here, but this weekend what we have left is going to go in church. Well, guess what? There's not many copies for church. And so once it goes available to the public, so anyway, this is what I understand. This is my first year, and my first year I'm just doing everything the way it's been done in the past. So I have a feeling that we're going to have to revisit this next year, because if there is the desire that I'm understanding that there is among other people, then perhaps Hope University might need to find a partner in this to order enough copies for everybody. But for this year, it's a Hope University purchase, so therefore it's available to you first.
The 5 people you meet in heaven is the same author, Mitch Albom?
Same author. And Pastor Dean wrote a synopsis of that, if you would like a copy of that as opposed to the book itself. Some people have chosen to just go ahead and get the book. It came out, how many years ago? It was like 15 years or something like that. So, I mean, I read it, and a lot of people read it, but really needed a refresher, and so that's what he meant his synopsis as being. So all those copies are gone, but we can make more if they're needed. Okay? Yeah, Bonnie?
It's sort of unrelated, but this Right Now service that you can get on the internet or through your mail, I mean, it tells you in your mail that this is coming, it's so much there that I would like some direction onto some of the interesting things that might be available related to what we're doing.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that then and see if I can give any guidance on that. All right? Okay, any other questions before we start? Because we have a packed, getting this in an hour and a half today is going to be tough. How many of you read 2 Corinthians? How many of you, I had a gentleman last night said I got 2 pages into it and I got so lost I just stopped reading. Okay. 1 Corinthians, it was long, it was 16 chapters, and we went along and we saw there were a few verses there in the middle. We said, well, Paul may not have written these verses, but for the most part, it kind of flowed. You're going to see, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, is trying to figure out how to spend this next hour and a half, because this letter is nothing short of a mess. And we're going to talk about the history of this letter and what it could have been. So it's going to be kind of different, because we're going to probably spend more time about the theories about what this letter could be and what went into the creation of this letter as we have it today. So we're probably going to spend more time with that. And then when we actually get to the letter itself, we're probably going to go kind of fast, because it kind of falls under big generic themes. There are some verses that I want us to read, because I think that they're sort of indicative of what the mood is and what Paul is trying to say in it. Starting with this one right here, the title, Clay Jars. Probably, I think, the most beautiful image from this entire letter, his image of the clay jars. Now, you're going to notice in the handout I gave you, this is a little different than what I've given you in the past, because I don't have the PowerPoint in there. What I have basically are the little exhibits that I want to use to be able to talk about this. So when I get to some of these things that you normally see on the handout, for example, the study questions, they're not going to be there. I can pretty much guarantee you won't have time at the end to talk about the study questions, but I'm going to still show them as I always do, because really the study questions, as I've said before, are goals. So our title here really is 2 Corinthians, Treasure in Clay Jars, because that is the overriding image from 2 Corinthians, that we have a treasure contained in clay jars. And if we look at the study questions really quickly, this number 1 is what we're going to spend most of our time on. We're going to talk about, oh, by the way, the back TV works now, but the only way it works is if we use this old Mac. And this is like a really ancient Mac, because a modern computer is incapable of dumbing down to the resolution of this TV up here. So if I use my wonderful Windows computer, or Pastor Ronnie uses his, because we checked his yesterday too, those TVs back there work, but this one doesn't. So all we needed to do was find a dumber computer that could dumb down to the resolution here. And this has issues, because this screen that I'm seeing here looks nothing like this. So this is working for now. This is not our final solution. Okay, it just came out of a staff meeting where I spoke very loudly that this is not a final solution. Okay, so which theory or theories about the compositional history of 2 Corinthians makes the most sense to you? We're going to see that there are several of them. We're going to reach a conclusion about what I think this is. I'm going to go with the majority of scholars, basically. But we're going to look at what those could be. How does Paul use the image of the clay jar? And we're going to look at this again, not necessarily what it means to us, because clay jars have a different meaning to us than they would have to somebody who's living in the year 55. As far as where the place of that would be in their life. Paul has very different views on what leadership looks like from his opponents, and his opponents have gotten pretty bad. Okay, we've seen opponents in all the letters we've done so far, and now all of a sudden they're very, very sophisticated, and they're really starting to make some inroads. And so we're going to see that Paul's language gets pretty harsh. And he's going to talk about a whole different way of seeing leadership in the context of a Christ-believing church. And this is what the key thing is going to be. Paul has talked about the understanding of being a suffering apostle already. Now, we're basically doing these letters in chronological order. So when we first looked at Thessalonians, it was a little smattering of it in there. We got to the Galatians, and he talks a little bit more about suffering. We got to 1 Corinthians 2 weeks ago, and all of a sudden it becomes front and center. In this letter, it is the dominant theme throughout. And he brings it up in the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's going to be present throughout the whole thing. The idea of the suffering apostle. Okay, moving on. He boasts of his weakness. What sense does that make, and how does Paul use that boasting in his ministry? Again, he's done that in 1 Corinthians. He does that even stronger in this letter. Okay, because again, his opponents are going to boast, but they're not boasting in weakness. They're boasting in strength, and he boasts in weakness. And then finally, the last one, how could Paul have handled the problems in 2 Corinthians differently? You're pretty limited when you're living in the year 55. not like you could send out some tweets to handle this. So, you know, you're real limited. You either write letters or you visit, and he did both of those. So we'll talk about that. So I'm going to begin this the way I've begun every letter, and that is with kind of a fictional gathering of people. This one's a little different. I didn't feel like you needed to have this in writing because it doesn't have as many details as the ones in the past. So again, you're in Corinth. So picture yourself in Corinth at the time of this writing. It says, in response to the missionary conversation and preaching of the Apostle Paul, you were baptized some months ago. It was a glorious event. You felt the Spirit's surge of power then and for weeks afterward. Your belief in Jesus as the Christ is still solid, but you wonder why God's power is not evident in your life in more obvious ways that can be seen by others. Because of that concern, well, before I get into that, remember, Paul comes, he's talking about the end's going to come, everyone's excited, everyone's in a frenzy, and as time goes on, it's pretty obvious the end is not coming. And then people get concerned because you have this wonderful, glorious experience of what it means. And we've had those before in our life. We've had these glorious experiences, and they don't last. It feels great, but then all of a sudden, it kind of becomes reality. So that's what's happening here. They were on fire with the Spirit, and then life became normal again. Now what do we do? And Paul is nowhere to be found. He's not here anymore. But he's written a letter. So because of that concern, your ears immediately pick up Paul's remarks as his latest letter is read in the assembly of believers. Quote, we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. You know all about clay jars. You store olive oil and wine in them at home. You see them in most shops and all corner snack bars and see pieces of broken jars everywhere you walk. Clay jars are wonderful objects in which to store things, but they do crack and can break just like you. But God gives the treasure of the good news of Jesus to you, a very breakable yet usable clay jar. And that reminds you that the power is God's and is hidden to unseeing eyes. Now, as I said last night, to us, clay jars are decorative, right? If we have a clay jar, it might be something that we have a candle in or something like that. We don't use clay jars for storage the way they would have. We use glass or Tupperware. Paul doesn't say, God's treasure is given to you in Tupperware, okay? It's clay jars. So you have to picture a society where that is the way you stored everything, okay? That's the way everything would have been stored, and as they break, which they are going to do, the pieces would be everywhere on the streets, kind of the way we would see leaves in the fall. There's going to be pieces of clay jars, so you're constantly reminded of the fragileness of it, but also how it is something that is very useful in storage. Also, you can't see inside it unless you open the lid, right? So there's a hiddenness to it. This precious treasure is inside a clay jar that if I'm looking at it, I can't tell what's in it. But if I open it up and look in, I can see what it is, okay? But it doesn't come from me, and that's why I can't see it. So it's a beautiful image for his audience. And it's still nice because we understand what a clay jar looks like, but it's not quite as part of our day-to-day life as it would have been for them. Okay, so you might have thought, and again, you're not going to have this. 2 weeks ago, we looked at 1 Corinthians. We know that Paul wrote because there were problems with people who were coming in and preaching a gospel that was contrary to his. And if you remember, he said, we can't even really call it a gospel because it's not really the gospel that they're doing. So we would have thought the 1 Corinthians solved all the problems in Corinth. Unfortunately, by the time of 2 Corinthians, circumstances confronting Paul were even more difficult and complex than before. 2 Corinthians is an unbelievably complex puzzle. So if you read it, did anybody get through the whole letter? Okay, and if you did get through the whole letter, I hope that you feel like you had whiplash by the end of it. It's like all of a sudden you're going this direction, then you're going this direction, then it's a sharp turn to the right, and then to the left, and then you're going backwards, and you're going all over the place. Well, there's a reason for that. We will discover a Paul who is battling, sometimes brilliantly, for his apostolic life. And that's going to be one of his big themes in this letter, is trying to defend against people who say he has no right to be an apostle, why he's defending he does have a right to be an apostle, and what that looks like. We talked about literary seams before. In 1 Corinthians, remember, we came up with a little piece that we said this probably didn't come from Paul. And we said one of the reasons you can see that is because of a seam. So think about what a seam is. If we're looking at material, a seam is basically two pieces of cloth that have been sewed together, right? If you have a good seamstress, okay, I have someone who made my stoles for me, and her seams are, she has sewed them together so beautifully that you can't even tell that there were two pieces of material, right? I mean, a good seamstress can do that. A bad seamstress, you can still tell, but seams are something that typically we try to put together. Well, there's lots of literary seams in this letter. The first one is between chapters 9 and 10. So if you look at chapters 1 through 9, as you get to chapter 10, you're going to notice a big change. Now, what are the changes? There's a change in subject matter, tone, and style. Chapters 1 through 7 especially seem to cover one kind of an agitation that Paul is writing about. It doesn't seem to be too bad. He has a lot of faith in the Corinthians. He says good things about them that he's not going to say in the second half. So the first half has this sort of loving tone to it. And chapter 7 ends with, I rejoice because I have complete confidence in you. That's very nice. And then all of a sudden, chapters 8 and 9 are about money. Now, where 8 and 9 go, we'll talk about later on. But so 8 and 9 are about money, and we'll talk about whether they go together or those are two separate things as well. And then all of a sudden, chapter 10 comes around, and these are really harsh words that Paul has for the Corinthians. Now, if you just ask for money in number 9, are you going to follow up appeal for money telling people how miserable they are? Not really a good way to get people to give, right? Please give your money, you worthless scoundrels. No, it's not really the best way to get people to pull out things from their pocket and put it into the collection plate. So all of a sudden we have this shift between 9 and 10 that doesn't seem to make sense. Also, chapters 1 through 9 are in first person plural. We, everything is we. And all of a sudden you get to chapter 10, and from 10 to 13 it's all I. So we have that kind of change as well. So that's the first scene. We're not going to read anything there. We're going to read some of these other things. The next one is between chapter 2, verse 13, and chapter 2, verse 14. In verse 13, Paul is talking about finding Titus. I'm looking all over for Titus, which, by the way, he can't find him, and he doesn't find him. Doesn't find him anywhere around Corinth. And then all of a sudden in 2:14, there's a thanksgiving that makes no sense. If you're frustrated because you're looking for somebody, you don't automatically go to a thanksgiving. But then if we jump from 2:13 over to chapter 7, it sounds like it flows together. So I want to read a couple of verses. If you would open up to chapter 2, verse 13. Okay, chapter 2, verse 13. Paul says, I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia. So do you think he was in a thankful mood? He didn't find Titus. He gave up looking for him, and where does he go? Macedonia. Okay, now turn over to chapter 7. And look at verse 5. For when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside, fears within. See how that flows from where we were. I went to Macedonia, so if I'm reading the letter, my next question would be, okay, what happened when you got to Macedonia? And he begins to tell that. Okay, so it sounds like we have a giant interruption here, all the way from chapter 2, verse 14, all the way up to chapter 7, verse 4. Looks like a big interruption. And we'll talk about that more here in just a few minutes. I just want to give you an idea of how things suddenly shift here. So we have sort of a disconnect here between verse 13 and verse 14. The next one is between 6:14, 7:1, and what surrounds it. Okay, so if you look at chapter 6, it goes from 14 all the way to 18, 4 verses, and then chapter 7, verse 1, and then all of a sudden it switches over to something else. So what I want to talk about here with this is, if you look at before this, if you look at before 6:14, Paul is talking very affectionately to the Corinthians. He's appealing to his listeners. And suddenly, if you go to 6:14, it's real harsh words. That makes no sense. Just suddenly a complete change in what your tone is. But then when you go to 7:2, it goes back to affectionate words. It's as if somebody stuck in something from 6:14 to 7:1, which has strong, non-Pauline characteristics. So let me just say a couple things about this, from 6:14 to 7:1. That's not a lot, right? We just said that's 5 verses. In those 5 verses, there are 8 words that appear nowhere else in the New Testament, much less Paul. Paul didn't use them. Nobody used them. It uses language that indicates that believers should cleanse themselves. Paul would never have said that, because Paul believed that God could be the only one who could cleanse us. Paul was never into us doing that action. That was a God action. And if you read these verses, if you read these 5 verses, the language and the theology sounds a lot like the theology of the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran. So it doesn't sound like something from Paul, it sounds like something from outside. So again, we'll talk about that later on, okay? And then the last theme we have is between chapters 8 and 9. Okay, so between chapters 8 and 9, I already said these are the 2 money chapters. They both deal with collections, but it sounds like it's different times. Well, why do I say that? In chapter 8, Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to give money. And he says to them, you know who you should look to for a good example? You should look to the Macedonians, the people up north of you. They did a great job in giving. That's your example. And then guess what he does in chapter 9? He uses the Corinthians as an example for the Macedonians. Now, that doesn't make sense. That would be in the same letter, okay? One should have come before the other, you know, so he encourages one of them to do it. They do, and then he uses them as an encouragement for the other one. So anyway, that's kind of what 8 and 9 does. Also, chapter 9 begins with what sounds like an introduction. So why would, if you've done chapter 8 to appeal for money, and then all of a sudden chapter 9 starts and you sound like you're introducing it again, it sounds like we have 2 separate things here. Okay? All right. So now, that's what we have. We have to put these pieces together to try to figure out what's going on. And we're going to see there's lots of different ways of doing it. Okay, so here are the proposals. And this is in your handout on page 1, up at the top. The first proposal is the simplest, except keeping it as a whole letter, and that is to say, we said there seems to be a seam between 9 and 10. Just put chapters 1 through 9 and say that's one letter, and chapters 10 through 13 are another letter. The first proposal for this was in the year 1776. That's an important year for us, right? Now, it wasn't Ben Franklin who did it. It was a scholar by the name of J.S. Semler. But there have been many proponents since then who say, yes, this is two letters. And they say that the order is chapters 1 through 9 and then 10 through 13. You're going to see there's some others who say that it is 2 letters, but the order should be reversed. We'll talk about those in a second. Okay, so what do they say? Well, one of the things that they say is, well, they don't think that break between chapter 2, verse 13 and chapter 2, verse 14 is all that important. You know, Paul's just having a bad day, and so, you know, that can explain that. They say also that the little piece from 6:14 to 7:1, they admit it's not Paul. But they say, maybe he got a pamphlet in the mail. Maybe the Qumran community was sending out little door-to-door things, and he went outside and picked it up and said, oh, I'm going to stick this in my letter. Okay? So maybe he had access to something, and he goes, this would fit in really well right here. Well, first of all, where he put it didn't fit in really well. So it's hard to believe Paul would interrupt a thought to do that, because Paul is usually a very skilled writer, but that's what they say. Okay, Paul wrote from Macedonia shortly after Titus arrived. So Paul's up in Macedonia. Titus comes and he tells him that the letter of tears had worked. Anybody heard of the letter of tears? Okay, the letter of tears is really important. All right, and we're going to read chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 to find out what this, because it has a name, letter of tears. So chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Okay, Paul says here, I wrote as I did so that when I came, I would not be distressed by those who should have made me rejoice. I had confidence in all of you that you would all share my joy. For I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. So picture him writing this. What's he doing while he's writing? He is crying. This has become called the letter of tears. And so there are lots of theories about this letter of tears. So what I want to show you here is, okay, this is my first time to try and, let's see, what did Jimmy say I could do here? He said I could end show. And there it is. He's right. Okay. Wikipedia. When in doubt, Wikipedia will always give it to you. This is, by the way, I never let my students use Wikipedia, so I can't believe I'm doing this. But I'm using Wikipedia just because it's a real fast way of looking at it. If you do a Google search on many things, you'll notice Wikipedia is usually the first thing that pops up in a search. Okay. Now, if you're doing solid research, don't use Wikipedia as your source. But if you were to do a Google search on the letter of tears, this comes up under severe letter because it's called the severe letter or letter of tears. And this was a letter written to the Corinthians by the Apostle Paul. It's mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 4. That's what we just read, how Paul wrote this letter while he was crying the whole time. This description does not match 1 Corinthians, so there are two main theories on the severe letter. The first theory is that the severe letter is lost. We don't have access to it anymore. It did not survive until somebody happens to discover it. But as of now, we don't have it. The second theory is that this letter is what chapters 10 through 13 is. Remember, so we've said there's two letters here, 1 through 9 and 10 through 13. These people here say that's the letter of tears, chapters 10 through 13. And we're going to see the language there is a lot harsher. Chapters 1 through 9, he's playing nice guy. Chapters 10 through 13, not so much. Okay? All right, now let's see if I can get back to this. Okay. So that's the theory of that. Why would an editor do this? Why would they put these together? Well, they were looking at it and they said, oh, this one went to the Corinthians, this one went to the Corinthians, let's just put this together. There we go. Voila, we have it. And by the way, it appears like this happened kind of late because when Clement is writing in the year 96, he talks about 1 Corinthians but not 2 Corinthians. So it appears to not have been available yet at that time. But by the time Marcion writes in the 2nd century, he quotes from 2 Corinthians. So a few years later, it is available.
How can you have a 1 Corinthians without knowing this?
Well, it wouldn't be called 1 Corinthians. It would have just been called Corinthians. Okay, so remember, we're not necessarily looking at our Bible like all of a sudden the pages of 2 Corinthians are blank. It's just not in there because we don't have a canon yet. At this time, they have not picked the books that are going to make it. Remember, the Gospels, especially for John, John hadn't even been written yet at this time. So we're still, the whole canon of the New Testament is still developing. Okay, so now the people who say, yes, we agree it's two letters, but we think chapters 10 through 13 comes first and then chapters 1 through 9. Oh, first of all, the strengths of the first one is it's simple and it keeps everything in order. Okay, 2 letters. The first one is 1 through 9. The second one is 10 through 13. The weakness is, we talked about all those other seams. It's kind of, really, you think Paul just got a tract in the mail from the Qumran community and he just put the words in there? You know, he opened his door one day and saw it hanging on the doorknob, you know, in a plastic bag. No, I mean, so it seems like it downplays that. Now, the ones who want to take it and reverse the order of those two, this theory goes back to 1870. And they say that 10 through 13 is part of the letter of tears. And that Paul wrote that first, the letter of tears worked, and so now in chapters 1 through 9, he could be a nice, you Corinthians, you're not doing this, you're listening to these bad people, you've got to stop doing this. And it worked, and then in 1 through 9 are, you nice Corinthians, thank you for listening to me. So this is their theory. Also, they say that some statements in chapters 10 through 13 look forward and some in 1 through 9 look back. So that's what they say. The strengths are the simplicity again, 2 letters, and some interesting arguments. But the weaknesses are rearranging the order. Why would an editor have put them in reverse order? And then there's lots of arguments that 10 through 13 cannot be the letter of tears. The letter of tears was about an individual who acted up. It's about a person that we know nothing about. I'd love to have that letter. I'd like to know what that person did. But they infuriated Paul, and he's going to write about that, and he's going to say this, that's what this letter talked about. And 10 through 13 are not about an individual. They're to the Corinthians. The 3-letter approach here, it's really the same as these two, except it notices that 8 and 9 are both about collections, and it says, well, it makes no sense to put them both in the same letter, so therefore we'll do 1 through 8, and then we'll make 9 a separate letter, and then 10 through 13. Okay, now, the several fragments approach. This is closer to what we're going to end up concluding. Now, bear with me because this is not an easy thing to do. We're going to, after we go through this, we're going to go back and kind of look at a timeline of what Paul would have done. So in this approach, they say that Paul wrote a letter to defend why he was an apostle. These people are coming in and saying, this man is not an apostle. Why are you listening to him? We're actually more apostles than he is. So he goes to defend why he should be considered an apostle. And so this letter actually begins in chapter 2, verse 14, and it goes up to chapter 6, verse 13, and then it jumps over to chapter 7, verses 2 and 4. There's a little piece of it there. Okay? They say that chapters 10 through 13 are the letter of tears. Then they say this letter of reconciliation starts at the beginning of the book, chapter 1, verse 1, and it goes up to 2:13, which we see 2:14 begins there. This is basically going to be 1 through 7, anything we haven't already counted. So then it goes to 7:5, because that was 7:4, to 7:16, okay? And then it picks up 13:11 through 13. All right? There's a collection letter, and then this group says, you know, this is not Paul. This 6:14 to 7:1, those 8 verses are not Paul. All right? So that's the several fragments approach. Let me see if there's anything I wanted to say about this. Oh, we really don't know where the conclusion came from, because notice, well, we don't have it here, but 13:11 through 13, that's the conclusion to the letter. And it makes sense because it sounds really nice that it goes with the letter of reconciliation rather than with the letter of tears. It doesn't fit in with the harsh language. So we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. The fragments were combined, about this group says, about the same time as the writing of Acts and the non-Pauline epistles, those epistles that we're saying are not Paul, things like Timothy and Titus and some of those. They note that the authors at the end of the first century quote 1 Corinthians, but not 2 Corinthians, just like we said a minute ago, but they talk about Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, none of them. Let's see here. It's difficult to consider. And you struggled with it, then you may say, hey, that's the way it felt to me. It felt kind of like that as I was reading it. And then lastly, we have the people who say it's all one letter. It's all one letter. Now, again, that's the simplest. And they say, well, you know, Paul wrote it over a period of time. He had good days and bad days. On the good days, he talked nice. On the bad days, he talked not so nice. You know, he got something in the mail. He threw in the pieces from that. So it just said, you know, hey, if you write a letter, you're not always going to feel the same. All right, this is the one that's the hardest to defend because the seams really, also, it's really clear that there are different situations going on. We have different kinds of opponents. So here's our conclusions. We're going to say that these literary seams are real. They're not imagined. It's not just Paul had a good day today and a bad. The arguments for the unity of 1 through 9 and 10 through 13 seem weak. We can't say that this is 2 letters. For one thing, 8 and 9 both being about collection makes it automatically need to be at least 3 letters. Chapters 10 through 13 don't fit the limited data we have on the letter of tears, which is probably lost. The letter that I would most like to see is probably lost. We don't have access to it. And I told you the main reason for that. The letter of tears would have been about this individual who was acted horribly and needed to be called out in some way. And chapters 10 through 13 are not. The correct order is, so it is in the correct order. 1 through 9 happened first and then 10 through 13. Because it seems like there was fresh trouble that broke out after the writing of chapters 1 through 7. So he's talking about one set of opponents in 1 through 7. And then when he gets to 10 through 13, there are some more sophisticated, worse opponents that he's talking to. And that's why his language gets harsher. If you read it with this mindset, you'll see that he's talking about different things going on in the beginning of the book and the end of the book. And definitely the text from 6:14 to 7:1 is not Paul. He did not write that. All kinds of reasons to say he didn't write it. Basically, the theology isn't his. And someone made the point last night, they said, why would Paul have stuck in something from somewhere else that has theology he doesn't agree with? And that's a good point. Even if he did get a mailer from the Qumran community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, he wouldn't go sticking it in his letters unless he in some way agreed with it. All right, you have a copy of this.
So you're saying that it's actually the first theory is what we're going with, 1 through 9?
We're going to see our theory here in a minute. Ours is not, we haven't seen our theory yet.
Oh, okay.
Our theory is going to be even more complicated than.
Hope it's not more complicated than the several one.
But before we talk about our theory, let's kind of go through a timeline of what Paul did. Okay? So if we look at this timeline, Paul writes to Corinth sometime between the years 51 and 54. That letter A, is now lost. Okay? People might say, well, the first letter we have to the Corinthians is 1 Corinthians, right? But if you read 1 Corinthians, he makes reference to another letter that he had already written. So there's a letter before 1 Corinthians. There's a 0 Corinthians that we don't have. Okay? So that letter's gone. We don't have letter A. So Paul sends Timothy to Corinth for the collection. He sends him there. Remember, the collection was Paul's agreement that he made at the Council of Jerusalem, that in all of his congregations he would take up a collection to go back to Jerusalem to take care of the poor and to show unity. And in return, they let Paul have some leeway with how he worked with what they were calling converts. Okay, they wouldn't have to get circumcised and things like that. So we know that Timothy leaves in 54. Paul receives a letter, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and oral reports from Chloe and her people, whatever that is, Chloe's people. They tell him what's going on in Corinth. So he writes in response to that letter B. That's our 1 Corinthians. Letter A, gone. Letter B, that's our 1 Corinthians. And that's the one that the 3 gentlemen came bringing the letter, and they wait for him to finish writing his letter to take it back. Okay? Paul writes his apostolic defense letter, letter C, portions of which we have in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 14, all the way up to chapter 6. And then all of a sudden, this editor, for some reason, put in 2 verses in chapter 7. Okay? So this is going to be what we're going to call letter C. This is where he's defending why he should be an apostle. Okay, Paul makes a painful visit to Corinth in the spring of 55. He refers to it as painful. Okay? It did not go well. There were all kinds of reasons this did not go well. But we know that's around 55. Remember, we're not talking 1955. When we say the spring of 55, when I hear spring of 55, I tend to think of 1955. I have to remind myself this is the original spring of 55. Paul writes his letter of tears, letter D, which is now lost. And we just read this a minute ago, verses 3 and 4. But he also refers to it in verse 9 of that chapter, in chapter 7, verse 8 and 12. And he does that in the spring or summer of 55. And then Paul sends Titus to Corinth. Okay? He had sent Timothy up here. Now he sends Titus to Corinth. Paul meets Titus in Macedonia, and Titus has good news. Guess what, Paul? Your letter of tears worked. Good news. It worked. So Paul writes the letter of reconciliation, letter E. It's a nice letter. Why is it a nice letter? Because that really bad letter, the letter of tears, worked. And so he's happy, and he's writing this. We have that in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 13, and then chapter 7, verses 5 through 16, and maybe also the conclusion, chapter 13, 11 through 13, the conclusion of the whole letter. Why is it there? Because it sounds nice, and this letter's a nice letter. Okay? Paul arrives in Corinth in the summer or fall of 56 and stays the winter. During that time, he writes Romans. We'll talk about that after Lent when we do Romans, which will be our next letter that we're going to talk about. He leaves Corinth for Jerusalem in the spring of 57, which kind of brings to an end the writings that we have once he goes to Jerusalem. And then notice 14 is divided into two parts, A and B. Either Paul said, I need to put all this together, or more likely, an editor said, we got to put this all together. I mean, he opened up his Bible and he has all these pieces of paper in there for what Paul wrote, and he said, this is going to get lost if we don't put it together. So somebody said, let's put this together. And they didn't do it the easy way. They kind of put it together in a very haphazard way. So what does it look like? This is our theory right here. And this is on page 4 of your handout. So, notice A and B are not up here. Okay, so we have A and B. This picks up with C, D, E, F, G, and H. If you count, that's 8 letters. Okay, A is gone. We said A is lost. B is 1 Corinthians. Here's letter C, the apostolic defense letter. And we're saying that here are the verses right here, 2:14 through 6:13, and then this little piece in chapter 7. Here's the letter of tears, which is now lost, letter D, so nothing up there from the letter of tears. Here's letter E, the letter of reconciliation. These are really the two main letters right here, C and E. Those are the two big pieces of 2 Corinthians. This is the beginning of the book up through 2:13 until it hands off up there. And then it picks up here and goes over here. And then maybe the conclusion. Letter F is chapters 10 through 13. Okay, that's kind of the harsh letter. Letter G is a collection letter, which is chapter 8. Letter H is another collection letter, which is chapter 9. And then we have this interpolation, which means some outside source that somebody stuck in there. And then finally, somebody put it all together. So if you're reading through the letter and you felt whiplash, this is why. Because you start reading, you're actually in letter E when you start reading. And then you jump up to letter C, and then you jump down here to something that Paul didn't even write at all. And then you go back up to letter C, and then you go to letter E, and then you come down to a letter here, and you jump back up to this letter, and then you go back to that letter. See? Whiplash, right? So if you look at all of the sources and all the scholarship, this is probably what 2 Corinthians is. So you see my dilemma about how to go about doing this. I mean, I could just say, let's just start with chapter 1 and go through it, but unless you have an idea of how it's coming from different times. And these are historical, so this is chronological. This would have happened first, and then this, and then this. So these are in the order they would have been written. Okay? Okay. So, 10:45, and we haven't even started talking about the book itself. Well, we're talking about the book, but we haven't gone through the chapters. I'm going to do that rather quickly. So, first of all, notes on time and place. How do we know this is 2 Corinthians, not as opposed to, why are we studying this now instead of after Romans or before 1 Corinthians? Well, we've already talked about why it's after 1 Corinthians. But here's the main point. The whole collection process seems like it's more developed in this letter than it was in 1 Corinthians, but it's less developed than it was. Crises and the opponents that drive this letter. Okay, and I'm going to have a couple of notes here before we get into what you have in your handout. After writing 1 Corinthians, which he had problems in 1 Corinthians, there were some Judean Christ believers who came and challenged Paul's mission and gospel. So these were Jewish people who came and got to the Corinthians. And in letter C, Paul is confident that they're going to respond positively to him because these aren't really bad opponents yet. These people this is more a softball. We're going to get into hardball later. So his letter to them is very upbeat. In letter C, he's confident that they're going to respond. Then he makes this disastrous, painful visit, probably involving this individual who was the subject of the letter of tears. And then we have new, more serious and more successful invasion of critics that brought about letter F. When this group came in, these were the hardball hitters. So these were opponents up here, but they weren't as bad as these opponents down here. Those opponents down there really, it's unclear why Paul made his painful visit to Corinth, but he makes it clear how difficult it was for him that he was treated badly, probably in a public setting within the congregation. At the center of the misbehavior was a member of the community, and after Paul left, he wrote the letter of tears. Again, I'd love to know what happened. So it was very painful for Paul, and someone may have called him out publicly. I don't know what it was, but there was something that happened that was very, very painful for him. Again, Paul tells him the letter worked, and then Paul writes letter E that we don't have up there, which tells them how great they are, and continues on to letter F when the worst opponents come in. All right, so if you will look at page 1. I put this on page 1 on the bottom. I put this together wherever I could fit it, so I wouldn't have to use too much paper. So that's why it's not in order. Let's look at the attacks against Paul. And how do we know these attacks? Because this is what Paul says about them. Okay? So attack number 1. They say that Paul's letters and his gospel are unclear, and he vacillates. First this, then this. So that's their charge. He lacks letters of recommendation. Why are you taking him? He doesn't have a letter of recommendation. Would you take a job applicant without a letter of recommendation? No references here. Why are you listening to him? He enriches himself financially, especially through the collection for Jerusalem. This makes Paul really mad because we've already said Paul did not depend on them to pay for him. He set up his own shop and he supported himself, or other churches helped him. He never wanted to be a burden on the church where he was. But apparently they're saying, you know that collection he's taken up, you think it's going back to Jerusalem? No, it's not going back there. And if you remember, this was a problem in Galatia because he took up the collection and then skipped town. And there were some people saying, oh, wait a minute, he was just here. He took all our money. Where did he go? But remember, he got chased out because of opponents. Okay, only in his letters is he bold. In person, he is weak. So he's a big talker in his letters, but boy, you talk face to face and he's just... And then also on top of that, he's not an effective speaker. We're effective speakers. He's not. He's going to say, I may not have been trained in speaking, but I have knowledge. So he's going to counter that, but that's the charge that they're making against him. He literally walks according to the flesh. He is tied into the world. He's inferior to the super apostles. Now, who do you think the super apostles would be? Peter and all them, right? No. The super apostles is Paul using sarcasm about who these people are. The super apostles are these people bringing the charges. You so-called super apostles. So again, hear the sarcasm. But if you read it, we don't read it looking at sarcasm. And we think, oh, he's talking about Peter and James and all the bigwigs back in Jerusalem. Nope, that's not who he's talking about. He's talking about these people. His apostleship is so weak, he will not allow himself to be supported by the congregation. Oh, wait a minute, I thought you said they was taking their money. He is so weak, he can't even take your money. In fact, he's not a legitimate apostle. Christ does not speak through him. These are the charges that they make. Okay, so now let's take a look at this, and this is on page 3 of your handout. This is very long, and I don't necessarily like the way he puts these in the 2 columns, because the left column is supposed to be the way the opponents see themselves, and the right column is supposed to be the way Paul sees himself. And you see that in some of these, but some of them that appear just in 1 column, I'm not quite sure why they put it where they did. So they say that they carry with them written recommendations, testimonials to their mighty deeds. Remember, they told him he doesn't have any letter of recommendation. What does Paul say? My letter of recommendation is you. You're my letter of recommendation. You're all I need. In general, they boasted their accomplishments as a way to gain authority over the Corinthians. Paul counters with foolish boasting, especially his weakness. They claim to be apostles endowed with charismatic gifts. Paul derisively calls them super apostles. Okay, you special super apostles. They claim to have a strong public presence and sophisticated rhetorical skill. So in other words, they're like what you would expect. These Hellenistic teachers who went around and they got a lot of attention because their speech was beautiful. It was great oratory. They could do these unbelievable deeds, and so they attracted a lot of people. Paul says, again, like I said a minute ago, I may be untrained in speech, but not in knowledge. I've got knowledge. They don't have knowledge. They just talk. I've got knowledge. The letter shows how well trained in speech he really is. If you read this letter from someone who is studying rhetoric, you realize it's a brilliantly constructed letter. He uses rhetoric and irony and sarcasm so wonderfully. And we tend to read, when we say we're reading the Bible, we can't read it looking for anything funny or anything sarcastic or ironic. Paul's a human being, so he's using these tools as he writes. They boast of their descent and standing. They say they're Hebrews, Israelites, descendants of Abraham, and ministers of Christ. Paul says, well, I'm all those things too. But I'm a better minister because I suffer and they don't. Now, this is interesting. They emphasize that they're Judeans, but unlike what we saw in Galatia, they're not trying to get people to do circumcision. They're not trying to get people to do the Torah. They're not trying to get people to do the Jewish law. Paul points to his own visions and revelations, especially a heavenly journey. This is chapter 12, which is a fascinating chapter. And this is where he talks about this. I know a person who had this vision. They boast of visions here. He's going to say, well, you think you have visions. I know somebody who had a vision. And he's going to use the third person. And then he's going to go on to talk about his thorn in the flesh in chapter 12. From Paul's perspective, they proclaim another Jesus, a different spirit, and a different gospel from what he proclaims. I think this should be over in this column personally. It's possible that, seen again from Paul's perspective, they have the same confusion about the not yet of final salvation that Paul dealt with. If you remember a big problem there, and it's a problem we continue to have today, how much is already here and yet not yet here? And we are living somewhere in what one of the students in my preaching class called the messy middle. We're in the messy middle between the already but the not yet. So the kingdom is inbreaking, and it inbreaks a little bit every day, but it's not fully here yet because there's still a lot of things that are not working right. So we're there in the messy middle. They accept money to support themselves in their apostolic work, understanding that it is an apostolic right that they can exercise. And he comes back and says, hey, I'm not taking anything from you. I'm getting all my support elsewhere. He either works by setting up his shop or he gets it from other churches so that he can say, I'm preaching to you without cost. And that's really important for him to be able to say that. All right, let's start looking at the letter then. And this is pages 5 and 6 of your handout.
The recommendations that these other people came with, where were they coming from, do you think?
Well, the first set would have come, they were Judeans. But since they were not looking at following the Jewish law. They didn't come necessarily from Jerusalem.
But didn't he have recommendations from Peter after that Council of Jerusalem?
You would have thought, but there's no written recommendations. Paul still kind of, word gets around that Peter said, and Peter was there with him in a couple places, but for the most part, his recommendation is just word of mouth. And the longer he's around, the more general acceptance that he's going to have. So we start at the beginning, which is letter, not A, but letter E. Okay, we start at the beginning, which is not really the beginning. So let's see if I want to read anything from the beginning. Well, let's read the first two verses. I always like to read how Paul begins the letters. So if we read verses 1 and 2, he says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. And again, what I always love about his introductions, he never is a ham. He never tries to take all the attention. If he is writing with somebody, he makes it real clear in the beginning that this is from that person and for me. And it could be somebody that we've heard of and we know, like Timothy, or it could have been like in the 1 Corinthians, it was Sosthenes. We're like, I don't know that much about Sosthenes, but he still gives Sosthenes credit at the beginning. To the church of God in Corinth, together with all his holy people throughout Achaia, which would have been the geographic region around Corinth, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, again, if we go back to what a Greek letter should have, after the salutation, it should go to the thanksgiving, remember? And if you will recall, he actually didn't have a thanksgiving in Galatians, and that was supposed to let them know that he was not happy with them. This one doesn't have a thanksgiving necessarily, it has a benediction. But actually, that, if you think about it, that is a thanksgiving, but it's a thanksgiving to God. Okay? So I want to read, actually, verses 3 through 7, because I think this benediction is a good overview of what this letter is going to be about. So we're going to read verses 3 through 7 of chapter 1. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, everyone see the reference to sufferings there, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same sufferings we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our sufferings, so also you share in our comfort. Okay, so what's he saying there? If there is an affliction, God provides consolation. In other words, if you're suffering, that's okay, because God is going to come to the rescue. And then, if I get consolation, that means I can in turn console you. And both the sufferings and the consolation of Christ are abundant in Paul. Paul says, if you want to see what that looks like in work, look at me, because I'm what it looks like. It's been through my sufferings that I've been given consolation, and so I in turn can give consolation. And that really is the summary of what this letter is about. So where does it all start? What has to happen to you first? You have to suffer. It's all about suffering. You suffer first. We're going to see later on that he doesn't say just because you suffer, you don't pray that it be taken away, because he did, but it wasn't. But the suffering is okay, because through the suffering you get consolation, and through that consolation you in turn are able to console. And that's in a nutshell what this letter is going to be about. Okay, in this letter here, he's going to give his basis for his defense. So the body goes from 1:8 through 13:10. Okay, and 1:8, 2 through 13, this is his narration of the basis for his defense that he's going to be talking about later on. He starts off with his experience in Asia. And instead of saying things like, boy, when I was in Asia, I had the best Chinese food. I wish you could have seen the things I ate. Asia is all about, you want to know what happened in Asia? I suffered like this, and I suffered like that, and I suffered over here, and I suffered there, and it was just all suffering. That's the way he talks about his experience in Asia. Okay, and then he says he's going to talk about his experience in Corinth. And this is from verse 12 all the way to chapter 2, verse 13, which is kind of where we're going to end here, because you see, then it's going to jump down here. Okay, so what does he do when he talks about the Corinthians? Well, first of all, he begins by boasting about the Corinthians. Let's see here if there's anything I want to read from the... No, he just basically says, when I look at boasting, what I really want to boast most in is you. I boast in you. In the next section here, Paul's explanation, part 1, 15 through 22, that's where he gives his travel plans. He's real big about telling people what his travel plans are going to be, where he's going to be going next. Part 2 here, which starts with verse 23 and goes to the next chapter, verse 4, that's where he explains to them why he's not coming to visit them. He basically says, I didn't want another disastrous, painful visit and a repeat of the need to write another letter of tears. Now, by the way, this is another reason why we're going to see why we think that this would be a different letter than the later one, because later on he's going to tell them about a visit he's going to make. And here he's pretty clear. Folks, it's just too raw right now. It's not a good idea that I come visit you. The last one was a disaster. If I come back, it's going to be a disaster too. So I'm not going to come. And that's what he talks about in this section right here. In part D, he says, you know that guy who was the subject of everything that happened when I was there and the whole letter of tears? It's been dealt with. You all need to stop talking about it. You need to stop talking about what that guy did. He has been disciplined, and now it's time to forgive. Really important words, I think. Something that if you're looking at Bible study next week, what does it mean? Now, this is someone who apparently did something so bad that Paul wrote a whole letter about it. But he says here in these verses, it's been dealt with. The person's been disciplined. You all need to get over it and forgive that person and move on. So that's what this is about here, from 2:5 to 2:11. And then he's going to talk about their response to the letter of tears. He's just so pleased because Titus has told him that they responded to the letter of tears. And he ends by saying, I've been looking all over for Titus. I saw him when we were up in Macedonia, and I can't find him anywhere. And that's where it ends, because then it goes into this weirdness in 2:14, okay, where it suddenly doesn't fit together. So speaking of that, let's look at what happens then in 2:14. In 2:14, all of a sudden, he begins a different thesis. Okay, this is a different letter that's going on here. This is from letter C now. So this is actually from an earlier letter. Okay, so we're going to look at 2:14 through 17. Now, the editor did put the word but in here because they probably thought, you know what, if we put but in here, this will sound like it should flow. Because the very first word of chapter 2, verse 14 is but, thanks be to God. If you take the but out and just say thanks be to God, you can see where it sounds like the introduction of another letter. Thanks be to God who always leads us as captives in Christ's triumphal procession and uses us to spread the aroma of the knowledge of him everywhere. For we are to God the pleasing aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one we are an aroma that brings death, to the other an aroma that brings life. And who is equal to such a task? Unlike so many, we do not peddle the word of God for profit. On the contrary, in Christ we speak before God with sincerity as those sent from God. Consoling words, right? This is letter C. This is when things are still going pretty well. It's not till later on that his words get harsher. Okay, now this is all about, see what it says, apostolic defense. So everything here is going to be about his defense of why he is an apostle. Okay, so in verses 1 through 3, his letter of recommendation, it's not a letter, it's you, the Corinthians. You are my recommendation. He's going to talk about his ministry of a new covenant from verse 4 all the way to chapter 5, verse 21. So this covers a lot of territory. His source of competency is God. God is the one who provides the competency, not a letter, not any other credentials. God is the one who provides it. He's going to contrast the two glories in 3:7 through 18. What are the two glories? Well, the first glory, remember what was Moses' face like when he came down the mountain with the 10 Commandments? His face was shining bright. That was glory number 1. Glory number 2, the face of the resurrected Jesus. But he's going to tell them that that old glory is gone. And I want to read that verse. That is chapter 3, verse 14, I think. Yeah, chapter 3, verse 14. I want to read what he says about that. He says in chapter 3, verse 14, "But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed because only in Christ is it taken away." So not only is that old glory not even valid, but if you hear the old covenant read, if you hear the Torah read, it makes you dull. So you need the new glory. Christ came with the new glory. Okay, in chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, he's going to start his content of his proclamation, what he is and what he's not. He's going to talk about how the fact that God called him, no one else did. Let's see here. He goes on to talk about how he doesn't lose heart or become discouraged. Now, this is where the crux is right here. This is where he develops his suffering ministry from chapter 4, verse 7 through chapter 5, verse 10. This is where he's going to say that he starts off with that beautiful thing we started off with at the beginning of class, the treasure in clay pots. He says, "The treasure of God's glory and the good news of Jesus is given not to perfect people with no problems, but rather to us who are clay jars, to make it clear that the extraordinary power comes from God and not from us." And the rhetoric in this whole section is really wonderful because he tries to make his case in a clear and convincing way. He says, "I've suffered, but I don't feel abandoned. I don't feel like I'm tempted to give up at all. Because it's in my suffering that I carry in the body the death of Jesus." He's able to live out and proclaim the life of Jesus. He links his suffering to the life of Jesus and understands that his own suffering is a witness to Jesus and the life that he offers. It's Paul's theology of the cross. It all comes from suffering. His opponents, they have a theology of glory. It's all about being on top, having power. That's not to Paul. To Paul, it all comes through suffering. He's going to go on to talk about how he's looking forward to the resurrection of the body, and he understands the future is providing power to serve in the present. "I don't lose heart for the slight momentary afflictions or preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measures." He's going to contrast our earthly tent, which is our body, with the glorious resurrected body that we're going to have. And then his last thing that he talks about here is ministry of reconciliation in verses 11 through 21. Jesus has died for all. Now, we don't need to go read that. We read it last night, but it says, Jesus died for us all. And we talked about last semester how the translation really shouldn't be for us all, but it should be on behalf of or in place of us. It's more of a substitution rather than doing it for. We are the ones who deserve to die, but instead of us dying, Jesus died in our place. Okay? That's what the verbs are that we kind of lose in our translation. Let's see here. In Christ, God's made us all new creatures. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. How? It's all from God. We're called to be God's ambassadors, which would have been a word from the Roman Empire. An ambassador was the official representative. Okay, kind of like what we're saying if you go to the Spark service at Lake Weir. If you're a member of Hope, you're an ambassador. You are a witness. You are on the hospitality committee. And Paul said that's the way it is for everybody. We're all called to do that. No one should be resting on your laurels. We all should be doing that. In chapter 6, verses 1 through 10, Paul gives his self-commendation. And he talks about 37 different ways that he's to be commended. When you give 37, something will stick, right? So he thinks of every possible thing that he could think of as to why you should look to him. And he has 37 things. There's a laundry list where he includes beatings and riots and hard work and sleepless nights and hunger. But if that's not your boat, then he talks about love and truthful speech and the power of God. And if you like things to be sort of like a contrast, then he'll talk about honor and dishonor, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich. It's a list of a lot of different things. Somewhere on there you're going to find some reason why Paul's your man. And then his rhetorical crescendo is reached at the end of his lists, and it's carried over into the fourth portion of his defense. You have this emotional conclusion here in chapter 6, verses 11 through 13. And then all of a sudden you get to this really weird thing that starts in 6:14. It's this emotional crescendo, and then all of a sudden somebody stuck in this piece that has nothing to do with anything. So if you read it and you look at it from that vantage point, you'll see it doesn't make any sense what's happening. So it actually makes sense if you jump over to 7:2. So let's take a look at this. I want to read this. So we're going to look at 6:13. And actually, I'm going to start back up at 11. So we're going to look at 6:11 through 13. Paul says, "We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. We've opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you're withholding yours from us. Please don't do that. Don't you see I'm giving you all my affection? As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children. Open wide your hearts also. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers." What? What happened here? You were just telling me how much you loved me. And, okay, instead, jump over to 7:2, chapter 7, verse 2. "Make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one." See how that flows from there? The open heart image. So we want to go directly from 6:13 to 7:2. Okay? So what about this little piece here in the middle? This 6:14 to 7:1. We're not going to read it because it's not Paul. And everyone agrees that it's not Paul. But what does it talk about? Well, it's real heavy on separation from unbelievers. Okay, that's not what Paul would have said. Paul just said you're an ambassador. You're supposed to go out to unbelievers and bring them in, not separate yourself from them. That's not what Paul would have said. There's some scriptural support there to try to say this is why you do it. And then there's a conclusion. But it's not Pauline. Okay, it does not make any sense in the context of Paul's theology. Let's see. Don't be mismatched with unbelievers is the basic directive that we look at here. And then all of a sudden it goes back to, and what we see here in chapter 7 is we go back and we have two verses that resumes letter C, and then we have, starting from verse 5 to 16, we resume letter E. So for some reason this editor took these letters and just plopped off the end and stuck them in chapter 7. Okay, kind of an interesting little thing here. We just read 7:2. Okay, this is where he continues the theme of make room in your hearts for me. And he concludes with a strong statement of confidence in the Corinthians as well as reminding them of affliction. And then when we get to 7:15 through 16, all of a sudden Paul goes back to why he should be an apostle. Okay, which is what he had been talking about in letter E, why he should be an apostle. Okay, and this is where he's going to go ahead and talk about the letter of tears. And so I want to read verses 8 through 13 in chapter 7. This is what Paul has to say about the letter of tears. Now, before we read this, imagine he has sent this horrendous letter just basically reaming them out. Now, have you ever sent a text or an email to somebody that you kind of say later, oh, I wonder if I should have done that, especially when you don't hear back from them? Maybe I shouldn't have sent that. I've heard back from them. What are they thinking? Should I send a follow-up? Should I call them and say, look, I'm sorry, I was rash. So Paul sends this letter. So here's what he has to say about it. Even if I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it. I see that my letter hurt you, but only for a little while. Yet now I'm happy, not because you were made sorry, but because your sorrow led you to repentance. For you became sorrowful as God intended, and so were not harmed in any way by us. Godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation and leaves no regret, but worldly sorrow brings death. See what this godly sorrow has produced in you, what earnestness, what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation, what alarm, what longing, what concern, what readiness to see justice done. All because of my letter. My letter did all that. I'm so glad I sent that horrible letter to you. At every point you have proved yourselves to be innocent in this matter. So even though I wrote to you, it was neither on account of the one who did the wrong, see there, the one who did the wrong, nor account of the injured party, the person who was injured in this, but rather that before God you could see for yourselves how devoted you are to us. By this we are encouraged. So you can see that Paul's now glad because Titus said to him, Paul, guess what? The letter of tears worked. It worked, and so now Paul's happy. He goes, I regretted it first, but I regret it now because I see it worked. It's good, but I was a little worried about how this was going to happen, but it worked. Everything is good. Okay, so now let's move on quickly to, I'm going to go through these very quickly because these are the financial letters. Letter G is chapter 8, and this is where he basically is giving the example to the Macedonians to get them to donate. His rhetoric is wonderful in this chapter. We don't have time to go through it, but he says things like, since you excel at everything else you do, surely you're going to excel in giving. You know, Jesus was generous to you. I think you should be generous to me. You know, these kinds of things. So that's what he says in chapter 8. In chapter 9, it's an appeal to a different group. Now he's appealing to all the people of Achaia. He's using a different example here. And I think that's it that I wanted to say about that. Okay. And our final letter that we have here, that is chapter 10 through 13, okay, is again back to Paul's apostolic defense. It's not the letter of tears, but it's still blunt and hard-hitting. This doesn't have a name, by the way, because this is addressing those later people who came in. He talks about the charge that he's humble face-to-face, but behold, bold behind their backs, and that really angers him. He says it twice. He says it again in chapter 10. He goes on a boast of belonging to Christ, who gave him authority. He says, you know who they compare themselves to? They compare themselves to themselves. That's what they do. They compare themselves to themselves. I wouldn't do that, which is exactly what he's doing. But at least he knows the limits. They don't know the limits. How dare they come into my territory? They shouldn't be doing that. And then he goes into the fool speech, which is chapter 11 and 12 there. This jealousy section right here, 11, 1 through 4, is where he talks about himself and Jesus as the bride, and talks about what that image of marriage to Christ would be like. He goes on to say, I'm not inferior to my opponents. I may be untrained in speech, but not in knowledge. I support myself because if you support me, then we get into the whole client-patron relationship. We talked about that last semester. Once you get into that, then you're into measuring. Okay, have I given you the same amount you've given me? No. He doesn't want to get into that. So he would rather just them not support him at all. He has really serious accusations against his opponents. False apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves. Again, we don't have time to read 11, 16 to 21. This is dripping with sarcasm. It's the harshest language of the letter. The acid almost eats through the paper. It's very sarcastic. As he says, you have allowed yourself to be slapped in the face by these people. I mean, it's very strong language. The opponents say they're Hebrews, Israelites. Guess what? I am too. They say they're ministers of Christ. Well, I'm a better minister because I suffer. To the world, these sufferings are foolish. They show he's weak, but that's exactly what's true, because in weakness, God is manifest. He continues by talking about this vision. He says, okay, you all have visions. Well, let me tell you about this man. And he had a vision where he was raised up to the third heaven, and he describes all this. And he makes it sound like he's talking about somebody else. Well, using the third person was a common rhetorical device in antiquity to talk about yourself. But you did it when you didn't want to become the subject. He doesn't want to be talked about as being someone who is caught up in a vision to the third heaven. He wants to be a suffering servant. So he uses that example to say, well, I know somebody who had visions, but here's what it's about. I want to boast to you in weakness. And so he goes right back to how he qualified by suffering. He boasts of weaknesses. And then oh, look at this announcement of a third visit. Remember, he just said earlier, I can't come see you. It would just be too painful. Well, this is a different letter. Time has passed. Now I'm ready to come back. I'm ready to come see you. And then his defense regarding finances, about why he's not taking money from them. Let's see here. He still has fears about that third visit, though. He has fears that he's not going to be what they expect him to be, and they're not going to be what he expects them to be. So he still has some fears. Okay, now, I skipped over this. Back up in chapter 12 when he talks about his thorn in the flesh. We don't know what that is. There are scholars read all kinds of things on this in the last couple of weeks. There are people that say it was intermittent or encroaching blindness. I even read a theory that said that it was a hemorrhage that took place when he fell off the horse on the Damascus road. And it didn't impair his intellect, but it caused problems in seeing, walking, and writing. But it may have been something that embarrassed people, because he said to the Galatians that forced him to stop and stay with them for a while. And he says it was obvious to them, maybe even offensive. It put them to the test, he says. But they didn't scorn or despise him. So some have said maybe he had malaria or epilepsy, something like that. Others think it's a figure of speech and that he's just talking about mysticism. But that doesn't seem possible, because this is very real to him. He prayed how many times for it to be taken away? 3 times. And every time God said no. Every time God said no, my grace for you is enough. It's sufficient. So that your power is made perfect in weakness. So again, Paul's trying to counter his opponents who are looking for power. Okay. And then we have the conclusion here. Now, I'm going to take a look at this conclusion. So turn to, there's so many parts here I would have liked to have read, but before we read the conclusion, let's jump up a little earlier in this chapter. So chapter 13, I want to start with like halfway through verse 2 in chapter 13. Paul says, on my return, I will not spare those who sinned earlier or any of the others, since you are demanding proof that Christ is speaking through me. He is not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful among you. For to be sure, he was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by God's power. Likewise, we are weak in him, yet by God's power we will live with him and are dealing with you. He's basically saying, just wait till your dad comes home. You think I'm going to come? I've been telling you how weak I am. Well, guess what? When I come, there's not going to be any weakness here. Your dad's coming. Get ready. The switch is going to be out. I'm not dealing with you in the weakness of Christ, but in the power of Christ. Okay, that's what he's saying there. Now, let's jump to verse 11. Finally, brothers and sisters, rejoice. Does that seem like that would have been written in the same reading? Strive for full restoration. Encourage one another. Be of one mind. Live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. Greet one another with a holy kiss. That's come. I'm going to be ready for some action. God, here, grace, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. To which you say, and also with you. So, did it work? The Corinthians didn't say whether it worked. They didn't leave anything behind. They didn't say, man, Paul really helped us out, and leave something behind in their library. Paul's going to tell the Romans that it worked. He's going to tell that these people there really share their resources with the poor. They know what they do. When I take up the collection, they put everything, including everything there. They give their all. So he give the sense when he writes to the Romans that it works. Taken as a whole, 2 Corinthians is Paul really talking about what it means to be an apostle. What does it mean to be an apostle? It's the cross. It's all about the cross, suffering and weakness. And his opponents, they want to go right for the glory, but that's not the way life works. With God in Christ, everything is about suffering. Affliction is not a sign of an unfaithful minister like they're trying to say, but it's a sign of faithful ministry to Jesus. If we're afflicted, we shouldn't say this means God is against us. which is what those opponents were saying, which is what so much of Judaism tried to say. If there's affliction, then something wrong. If you can't find sin, maybe it was your parents' generation or your grandparents' generation or something that caused that. Paul says, no, it isn't that. It's good news because it's in that suffering that God's power is present. And I found this is a school, this is their logo, St. Paul's School of Theology. And the reason I put this up here is because, in my opinion, based on what I see of Paul's writings, the symbol that we should always think of when we think of Paul is the cross, because the theology of the cross was central to his message. It's all about the cross. So if something out of something, Paul would say, no, that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is to say, how can I be weak so that God's strength can shine through me? If I'm strong, it's my strength shining through. So I really need to be sure that it's my weakness that's allowing God to be doing it. I can't take the credit for it. It's not because of anything I do. It's not something I have developed in myself. God is using me. When I become clear, God's power can be wonderful in there. You don't see that's where it's coming from. To you, it may look like it's coming from me, but it's not. It's coming from God through me. And that's what it's about. And that's it. I have 11:34. Any quick comments or questions? I'll stay behind for a couple things to give books to anyone who still has a book coming to you. And don't forget the Lenten devotional books that are up here for you all.